For centuries, the devoted followers of Jesus have scanned the sky for falling stars, the sun becoming darkened, the moon losing its light, among other signs that might signal the advent of the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ Spirit. The source of the prophecies of these signs being expected before he returns are found in the book of Matthew, chapter 24. This video is part 2 of a two-part video series that explains the meanings of these prophecies in Matthew 24 and how they have already been fulfilled. We pick up here in part 2 with verse 29, explaining how these prophecies have been fulfilled both literally and spiritually or symbolically. Again, this is part 2 of a two-part set. Please don't forget to watch part 1, preferably before this one. It may be helpful to watch the videos in segments, as needed. The description for this video in YouTube gives the approximate time markers for the start of the sections. The name of my YouTube channel is Integral Destiny 9. You can see it there at the bottom of the yellow and green boxes. This is the table of contents for this part 2 of the two-part video. If you've not seen part 1 yet, you have missed some really essential information contained in sections 2 and 3 on Bible terminology and the time prophecies, meaning when the Messiah would return. The year, that is not the day and hour, but the year is foretold, and that year is 1844, as Bible prophecies clearly foretold. We pick up here in this video with verse 29 in Matthew 24 and then subsequent prophecy verses. In section 5a we get down to the nitty-gritty on the prophecies and how they were fulfilled. After section 5a we go to section 5b, which explains the instructions and warnings that Jesus gave about what to expect and how to act at the time of the end of the age. Section 6 is just a brief review of some sources of information if you'd like to investigate the claims of the Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i faith further. This information is in both of the videos, at the end of the videos. Next we continue with where we left off at the end of part 1. Now, where were we? Is your memory a little fuzzy about the prophecies in Matthew chapter 24? Here are some reminders of the happenings and prophecies in Matthew 24. These were reviewed in part 1, so if you want to read them here, just pause the video. I won't be reading them to you like I did in part 1. This is a true story of how these prophecies have been fulfilled. It is an entirely new and logical way of looking at Bible prophecy fulfillment. And yes, it means that the Christ Spirit has returned, just as Jesus promised us that he would. If you've seen the part 1 video, the following information about the Messiah that you saw in part 1 is greatly abbreviated here in part 2, but you may wish to advance the video just a bit if you don't want to see it again. This video will explain when and how he returned and the evidence that the prophecies in Matthew chapter 24 have been fulfilled by 2 divine messengers. Number 1, the herald, the Elijah figure, just as John the Baptist was, and number 2, the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ, and also the Jewish Messiah, and also, by the way, the promised one of all the major faiths on earth. In the next several slides, I'm going to introduce the names and some information about who these divine manifestations of God were who fulfilled these prophecies. It will be somewhat abbreviated from what was given in part 1 of this video set. Those of you who saw part 1 already may choose to advance the video a bit. FYI though, it is short, so be careful you don't advance too far. This slide introduces you to the names of the 2 manifestations of God who fulfilled the Bible prophecies of the coming of the Messiah in the latter days. The Bab, in English it means the gate, was the forerunner of the coming of the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah. This forerunner, in the top row there, is the return of Christ in the station of Elijah expected by the Jewish people. John the Baptist was the Elijah figure for the first advent of the Messiah. Now, if you look at the second column in the Bab's row, you will see some of the Bible terms for the gate or the herald or forerunner of the second advent, such as his being the Lamb prophesied as coming in the book of Revelation. He is also a thief in the night as he came, preached his divine message, was martyred, yet 178 years or so later, few even know of his existence and message yet. He was born in 1819 in Shiraz, Persia, in the ancient province known as Elam. He was killed on July 9, 1850, by the forces of the king of Persia as instigated by the clergy of Persia. He prophesied the imminent appearance of him whom God shall make manifest, the new Messiah for all of humankind for this age. The Bab proclaimed his identity and revelation in the year 1844 Common Era, as shown in the column on the far right. The new Messiah's title is Baha'u'llah, which in English means the glory of God or the glory of the Lord. He is the return of the Christ in the station of the Father. He is the Messiah of the second advent, the Lord of hosts, the one who sits on the throne, prophesied as coming after the Lamb in the book of Revelation. He is also the prophesied thief in the night because he appeared, proclaimed his identity, taught his message for 40 years, and passed on to the heavenly realm in 1892. And here we are in 2022, and the majority of humankind are still unaware that he was here, just as prophesied in the Bible. He was born in 1817. He experienced his revelation from God while in prison in late 1852, but he did not announce his identity and revelation for another 10 years, and he did that in April of 1863. In 1853, he was imprisoned because he was a disciple of the Bab. He was the person the Bab had prophesied as coming, which the Bab called him whom God shall make manifest. The new faith that resulted from their lives and teachings is the Baha'i faith. There are about 10 million Baha'is in the world, located all across the globe. There's about 170,000 of us in the USA. And the world center of the Baha'i faith is in Haifa, Israel, on Mount Carmel. Just to assure you that this is all real, here's an aerial photo of the main administrative buildings of the Baha'i World Center on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. I visited Haifa on religious pilgrimage in 2010. I've been in 3 of these 4 buildings and walked in the gardens surrounding them. They are very real. The Baha'i Faith's World Center is in Israel because the last 24 years of Baha'u'llah's life was spent as a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire in Akka, Palestine, which was used as a prison city for the Ottoman Empire at that time. Akka is across the Haifa Bay from the World Center's location on Mount Carmel in Haifa. At this point, this is all I'll tell you about the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i Faith. Much more will be explained as I review in this video the fulfillment of Matthew 24 prophecies by the Baha'i Faith founders and their faith. Here are 3 websites should you wish to learn more about the Baha'i Faith, its founding figures, history, beliefs, community, among other points of interest. The 2 websites at the top are good starting points to get some information about the faith and its main figures. The top one, Baha'i.org, is the official international site of the Baha'is of the world. The Baha'i.us website is the official website for the Baha'is of the United States. If you are interested in reading some of the sacred and authoritative texts of the Baha'i Faith, there is a free online library through the website at the bottom there, baha'i.org/library. And I thought I'd share with you this book on the prophecies of Jesus in chapter 24 of the book of Matthew as a source among many others of the information in this video. It's the Prophecies of Jesus, and the author is Michael Sowers. His scholarly yet very easily read and understood book was a great source of information and helped enormously in my understanding of the Bible. I highly recommend it. It's available through Amazon.com and probably some other online bookstores. In the first video, we reviewed how the first three parts of Matthew chapter 24 verse 29 had been literally fulfilled, that is, materially fulfilled, illustrated here by the listed parts of the prophecies in verse 29 being checked off. The sun will be darkened, the moon not giving us light, the stars falling from the sky. Next, in this video, part 2, we will go on to explain how the fourth part of verse 29 was literally fulfilled, how the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then, after explaining the literal fulfillment of these four parts of verse 29, then it will be explained how they were spiritually, that is, symbolically fulfilled too. What kinds of heavenly bodies could this be talking about? Here are some. Our sun and other stars, solar systems, galaxies, our moon, other planets and their moons, comets, asteroids, meteors, and other unknown heavenly objects. However, there are some problems here. Number one, how could a heavenly body be shaken? Or the powers of heavens be shaken? Number two, the shaking of a heavenly body. How would it affect us here on earth so that we would know it was a sign that the Messiah was soon to come? How would we know if a heavenly body shakes? And what is a power of the heavens? Much more than one of them. Note that powers and heavens are plural. Number three, this event or events would have to occur sometime just before, during, or shortly after the arrival of the Messiah and or his herald, meaning shortly before, during, or after 1844 through the year 1863. Why the year 1844? Remember from part 1 of this two-part video, the year 1844 was foretold by Daniel in chapter 8 of that book, that it's definitely the time period for such signs to appear, if those signs are to be materially or literally manifested in the world. We'll start with looking at that timeline to help us situate ourselves in time. And remember, this timeline is not to exact scale. The year 1844 is when the book of Daniel told us that the Messiah would appear. Therefore, it seems logical that the occurrence of an event or events wherein a heavenly body or bodies are shaken would occur in the window of time demarcated here by this red-bordered green background period of time. Recall that Daniel's prophecy of the year 1844 was fulfilled when the Bab, the herald or Elijah figure to the Messiah, made his declaration in May of 1844 in Shiraz, Persia. The Bab foretold the coming of him whom God shall make manifest within 9 to 19 years from his time. Then, in April of 1863, Baha'u'lláh made his proclamation that he was the Messiah, the person foretold in all the sacred scriptures of the past, and in fulfillment of the Bab's prophecy of the coming of someone he called him whom God shall make manifest. Knowing these dates will help us to try to pinpoint an event or events that may have literally fulfilled this prophecy in Matthew 24. I've not been able to find a direct confirmation of proposed literal events in my studies of Bible prophecy fulfillment from either a Christian or Baha'i reference, specific on either the NIV's, the New and International Version of the Bible's translation of the short phrase, heavenly bodies shall be shaken, or from the King James translation, the powers of earth shall be shaken. We did, of course, from the other three elements of verse 29, fulfillment on the stars falling and the moon not giving its light. We do have that from both the Christian and Baha'i viewpoints. However, this last element, just that heavenly bodies shall be shaken, is what I'm talking about here. It does, to my mind, point out one of the shortcomings of the literal-only method of the interpretation of Bible prophecy fulfillment. Wasn't that one of the chief reasons for the Jews to have rejected Christ, after all, that he didn't fulfill all prophecies literally? So I decided to do some research to see if there may be some previously overlooked events that may apply to this small clause in the prophecies. I reviewed these events for something that could literally shake us here on earth. The only one of these that could qualify is a little known but a rather earth-shaking event. Number 4, the Carrington event of 1859. The 1859 Carrington event. On September 1st, 1859, astronomer Richard Carrington in London, England, observed one of the largest solar flares, that's a coronal mass ejection, ever recorded. In fact, the first one recorded as well. It is also called the solar storm of 1859. For the following 2 or 3 days afterwards, the solar wind that apparently resulted from or was augmented by this solar flare hit the Earth, causing extensive damage. Telegraph systems all over North America and Europe failed. Telegraph pylons threw sparks, shocking the operators. Telegraph paper even caught on fire. Remember, in the year 1859, telegraph systems were about the only electrical systems in the world. There were no interconnected electrical power systems, no phone systems, no internet back then. If a solar storm event of this magnitude were to happen today, the damage to electrical, phone, and internet systems would be in the multi-trillions of dollars. That's with a T, trillions of dollars. Another report regarding the effects of the Carrington event, quote, just before dawn the next day, skies all over the planet Earth erupted in red, green, and purple auroras, so brilliant that newspapers could be read as easily as in daylight. Indeed, stunning auroras pulsated even at near tropical latitudes over Cuba, the Bahamas, Jamaica, El Salvador, and Hawaii, end quote. Here is a more recent view of a solar flare recorded in March of 2010. Note the inset in the upper left corner showing the approximate size of our planet Earth compared to this solar flare. Apparently, the 1859 eruption was larger than this one. According to the Center for Science Education, quote, solar flares emit huge bursts of electromagnetic radiation, including X-rays, ultraviolet radiation, visible light, and radio waves. The energy emitted by a solar flare is more than 1,000,000 times greater than the energy from a volcanic explosion on Earth, end quote. This is that timeline again. This time with the Carrington event of 1859, the pink vertical line between 1844 and 1863, added to it. It well could have been one of the signs of the appearance of the Messiah. meaning the proclamation in April of 1863 by Bahá'u'lláh that he is the long-awaited Messiah of the latter days. You may ask, but what about the King James Version's phrasing, "The powers of the heavens shall be shaken"? Such a massive electromagnetic event was definitely a power of the heavens, and it did shake things up in a sense. You decide. Some Bible prophecy buffs have taken this to mean that terrible earthquakes would happen, especially since the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 12 foretells, quote, "I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red." End quote. Basically, Matthew chapter 24, verse 29 is the same prophecy as the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 12. However, instead of Matthew's, "the heavenly bodies will be shaken," Revelation prophesies that a great earthquake will happen. That is, if you take all these prophecies as foretelling literal material events. Here are some additional prophecies of earthquakes from the New Testament. Luke chapter 21 verse 10, Mark chapter 13 verse 8, Matthew chapter 24 verse 7 speaks of earthquakes occurring at the time of the end of the age that Jesus spoke of. Revelation chapter 8 verse 5 mentions an earthquake, and Revelation chapter 11 verse 19 and chapter 16 verse 18 also do. Note, just because they all mention an earthquake, it does not mean that it is the same earthquake, literally or symbolically. Then we come to the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The Christians of the late 1700s and the early and mid-1800s in both Europe and North America viewed this great earthquake that devastated Lisbon, Portugal, as the earthquake of Bible prophecy. My own thoughts are, if there was a literal fulfillment of a great earthquake, a far more likely earth-shaking event fulfilled this prophecy of an earthquake would have been the tremendous explosion of a stratovolcano in the year 1815 in Indonesia, and that is Mount Tambora. It was mentioned previously in, I believe, part 1 video. On April 5th, 1815, Tambora exploded. The explosion was heard up to 1,400 miles away. A larger explosion occurred on April 10th, 1815 that ejected a huge amount of lava and ash. The explosive eruption on April 10 was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, even more powerful than the famous eruption of Krakatoa many years later in 1883. Here is a comparison of the explosive power of the three largest volcanic explosions since 1800, although I'm not sure where Tonga, the latest one we just had recently, how that would fit in here. I'm sure it would be less than Tambora. So Tambora is rated as a 7 in a logarithmic scale of 0 to 8 of volcanic eruptions. That's the bar at the far right. That was in 1815. Krakatoa, rated as a 6 on this scale, that's in the middle of the graph, was in 1883. Mount St. Helens, at the left, it was rated a 5 on the scale. It occurred in 1980. The scale used to rate the power of a volcanic eruption goes from 0 to 8. It is a logarithmic scale, which means that a magnitude 7 eruption is 10 times more powerful than an eruption at level 6. Then an 8-rated eruption is 10 times more powerful than a 7. The release of sulfur and particulate matter into the stratosphere caused global weather disruption. It caused the year without summer in the following year of 1816 in the northern hemisphere. Temperatures were reduced like 0.7 degrees to 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this is my choice as the most probable literal fulfillment of this prophecy because the Messiah of the Second Advent, Baha'u'llah, was born in 1817 and his forerunner, the Bab, was born in 1819. This explosion in 1815 announced their upcoming births. With Daniel's prophecy of the end of the age being fulfilled in 1844 by the Bab's proclamation, this monumental explosive eruption in 1815 would definitely qualify. You've seen this map before when we reviewed the dark days when the sun and moon did not give off their light. This map shows the extent of that ash cloud from the Mount Tambora explosions. The blast of the explosion was reportedly heard up to 1,400 miles away. Could that blast have been the trumpet blast announcing the coming of a manifestation or prophet of God appearing on the planet? Maybe so. Then we have the New Madrid earthquakes, plural, of the years 1811 and 1812. New Madrid is at the southeastern border of the state of Missouri and western Tennessee and Kentucky, as you can see on this map of the events. The initial shock on December 16, 1811 was estimated to be about 7.5 on the current scale. Aftershocks in January and February of 1812 were estimated to be at 7.3 and 7.5 respectively. There were hundreds of other aftershocks in the area of lesser degree. When the December 16, 1811 earthquake occurred, people as far away as New York and North Carolina felt the shaking. And there was an actual earthquake that happened a couple years after the martyrdom of the Bab. He was shot by a firing squad at the orders of the Persian king. When the earthquake occurred, many of those who were on that same firing squad were killed during this earthquake. The earthquake was the one prophesied in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, verse 13, as follows. And the quote, and the same hour there was a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, end quote. And the explanation from the writings of the Baha'i faith follow, quote, this earthquake occurred in Shiraz after the martyrdom of the Bab. The city was in a turmoil, and many people were destroyed. Great agitation also took place through diseases, cholera, dearth, scarcity, famine, and afflictions, the like of which had never been known. End quote. This is a very congested timeline here. I don't think I really need to say that. You can see it for yourself. Trying to pack in a lot of events in a fairly short period of time, about 100 years, into this tiny space is quite a challenge. I've included these earthquake, shaking, and heavenly events on our timeline. Note that the birthdays of Baha'u'llah in 1817 and the Bab's in 1819 are on the left side of the timeline, and their declaration dates are demarcated by the bright light blue vertical line, thick near the middle, labeled 1844. That's the Bab's declaration year. And Baha'u'llah's in the thick purple vertical line labeled 1863 to the right of it. Comets are shown in red font in the legend and red vertical lines on the timeline. Note that the label of great, as in the Great Comet of 1843, depends on several factors by the astronomers who first saw it. There apparently are no hard and fast rules delineating when a comet is deemed as great or not. First, in the legend on the bottom is A. There was the dark day of 1780. B is the late 1811, early 1812 New Madrid earthquakes. C, the Great Comet of 1811. D, 1815 Mount Tambora eruptions. and the dark days that lasted in the Middle East up into Europe and caused the year without summer in the following year of 1816. E, the Great Comet of 1823. F, the 1833 Starfall meteor shower. 1835 Halley Comet is G. H, the Great Comet of 1843. I, 1852's Biela's Comet. It was remarkable because it split into two segments. J, 1857 Dark Day in Amsterdam, Holland. K, 1858 the Comet Donati. L, 1859 the Carrington Event Solar Flare. M, 1860 Dark Day in Brazil. N, 1861 Great Comet of 1861. O, the Comet C, 1861 G1 Thatcher. P, Comet 109P Swift-Tuttle. It was discovered in 1862. Q, 1866 Starfall Meteor Shower. R, 1874 another comet. S, 1880 a great comet. T, 1881 another great comet. U, 1882 great comet. V, 1883 Krakatoa volcano explodes. W, 1886 Dark Day of Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And X, 1887 Great Comet. Note that Baha'u'llah left this physical existence in the year 1892, and the Bab was martyred in 1850. These shaking events occurred in monumental, history-making, literal ways, thus most definitely literally fulfilled in the timeline of the Book of Daniel, meaning around the year 1844. Some events occurred before, during, or after the births of the Bab or Baha'u'llah, and others occurred before, during, and shortly after their declarations. Thus, these were literally fulfilled. Okay, so these were literally fulfilled, to my way of thinking, before or shortly after a significant event in the lives of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, or in their faith, the Baha'i faith. But in our more scientifically advanced time, we can list hundreds of events in the heavens, meaning in our solar system or other countless solar systems. How can we possibly think that each and every such event out there has some significant meaning here on our teeny tiny planet called Earth? Just something to think about for our future visits of God's messengers. Will we be looking at the literal heavens for signs of their coming when we know so many of such events occur? How would we know what's what? Now on to showing the spiritual, also known as symbolic, fulfillment of these four prophecies that indicate the appearance of the expected Messiah. The fulfillment of them in symbolic, meaning spiritually significant ways, is far more important and meaningful. Hopefully you will soon understand why I make that claim, and maybe you'll even agree with me. And here is that verse, verse 29, again, quote, "Immediately after the oppression of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." End quote. And here are those four elements of the verse 29 prophecy distilled out again. Now you may be wondering, how could these possibly be symbolic in meaning? If you remember our discussion of terms in section 2 of the part 1 video of the two-part video series, you may have an inkling of their meanings. What does darkened mean, if not a literal darkening of the sun and moon? This explanation is again from the Messiah of this age. from the writings of Baha'u'llah, quote, "Hence it is clear and manifest that by the words, 'The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven,' is intended the waywardness of the divines," that's religious leaders, "and the annulment of laws firmly established by divine revelation, all of which, in symbolic language, have been foreshadowed by the manifestation of God." End quote. What does it mean that the laws of the previous dispensation were annulled? Another quote from Baha'u'llah, quote, "It is unquestionable that in every succeeding revelation, the sun and moon of the teachings, laws, commandments, and prohibitions which have been established in the preceding dispensation, and which have been overshadowed the people of that age, become darkened, that is, are exhausted and cease to exert their influence," meaning they do not give their light any longer. End quote. Furthermore, Baha'u'llah goes on to speak of the followers of all the existing religions on earth when his revelation commenced, quote, "They, the followers of the past faiths, still have not awakened to perceive that all the signs foretold have been made manifest, that the promised sun hath risen above the horizon of divine revelation, and that the sun and moon of the teachings, the laws, and the learning of a former dispensation have darkened and set." End quote. Then concerning number 3, the stars will fall from the sky. Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the Second Advent, speaks of his contact with the supreme religious leaders of his time. That's the Persian clerics. Quote, "When I came unto them in my majesty, however, they turned aside from me. They verily are of the fallen. This is what the Spirit, Jesus, prophesied when he came with the truth, and the Jewish doctors cavilled at him, until they committed what made the Holy Spirit to lament, and the eyes of such as enjoy near access to God to weep." End quote. The word cavil, by the way, means that the Jewish priests made trivial, petty, unnecessary objections to Jesus, rather than have important or meaningful concerns. Furthermore, this explanation of the meaning of falling stars, quote, "In another sense, by these terms, the sun, the moon, the stars, is intended the divines of the former dispensation, who live in the days of the subsequent revelations, and who hold the reins of religion in their grasp. If these divines be illumined by the light of the latter revelation, they will be acceptable unto God, and will shine with the light everlasting. Otherwise, meaning they do not accept the new manifestation and revelation from God, they will be declared as darkened, even though to outward seeming they be leaders of men, inasmuch as belief and unbelief, guidance and error, felicity and misery, light and darkness, are all dependent upon the sanction of him who is the day star of truth." End quote. What about the darkening of the divines, the clergy? When the Bab declared his revelation in Persia, many tens of thousands of people, possibly hundreds of thousands, came to believe in him as the fulfillment of prophecy. This included mostly Muslims, but also some Persian Jews and Zoroastrians. A number of Muslim mullahs, that's the clergy in Islam, the predominant religion in Persia, also came to believe in his cause. But many of the Muslim clergy and most of the Islamic leadership of Shia Islam, that's the sect that's most predominant in Persia, modern Iran, rejected his claim of being the Mahdi, the promised one of Islam, and eventually pushed the Persian king to put him to death, which occurred in July of 1850. After the martyrdom of the Bab in 1850, over 20,000 of his followers were also killed, partially due to the instigation of the Muslim clergy in Persia. This government and clergy combination then perpetuated persecution of Baha'u'llah, who they first imprisoned in an underground dungeon, then had exiled to Baghdad, which is outside of Persia and inside the borders of the Ottoman Empire, governed by the Sultan, who was based in Turkey. The clergy of Sunni Islam and the Ottoman Empire then together perpetuated this exile and imprisonment of Baha'u'llah, members of his family and followers. The persecution of the members of the Baha'i faith established by the Bab and Baha'u'llah continues to this day, especially in Iran, the modern name of Persia. What about the clergy and religious leaders of other faiths? Have they fallen? Many have been very open and accepting, especially within multi-faith or interfaith efforts, but few, if ever, look into the beliefs of the faith, especially regarding the Baha'i faith being the fulfillment of the prophecies of their own faiths, the coming of a Savior for their own faiths, especially as the return of Christ. Some clergy and religious leaders of other faiths are openly hostile or dismissive, because they are not open to alternative interpretations of the prophecies of their own faiths, just like the Pharisees at the appearance of Jesus. So, because they deny the new manifestation of God, they too have fallen and are darkened. The consequences of their being fallen is that they and the institutions of their faith no longer have the divine guidance of God. They've shut the door in His face, so to speak. This is also true because the Baha'i faith established by the new Messiah has no clergy at all. Baha'u'llah has revealed that humanity has achieved the spiritual maturity that a democratically elected hierarchy of institutions is able to guide the Baha'i faith into the new age. A clergy is no longer necessary. The longer the people of the world continue to ignore or reject the teachings of the latest manifestations of God, the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the worse their faiths and world conditions will fare. More divisions within and between the faiths will occur, falling away of followers, corruption of the pure faith of the original faiths that resulted from their initial teachings of their prophet. Misbehavior of the clergy and followers of the faith will occur. Regarding those clerics and divines, more from Baha'u'llah, quote, "It is clear and evident that whenever the manifestations of holiness were revealed, the divines or clerics of their day have hindered the people from attaining unto the way of truth. To this testify the records of all the scriptures and heavenly books. Not one prophet of God was made manifest who did not fall a victim to the relentless hate, to the denunciation, denial, and execration of the clerics of his day." End quote. And this from the writings of Baha'u'llah on the subject of foolish leaders. Quote, "And yet in spite of all these manifold revelations of divine knowledge which have encompassed the world, they, the foolish leaders, still vainly imagine the door of knowledge to be closed and the showers of mercy to be stilled. Clinging unto idle fancy, they have strayed far from the Urvatul-Vuthka, that's the sure handle, of divine knowledge. Their hearts seem not to be inclined to knowledge, and the door thereof, neither think they of its manifestations, inasmuch as in idle fancy they have found the door that leadeth unto earthly riches, whereas in the manifestation of the revealer of knowledge they find naught but the call to self-sacrifice. They therefore naturally hold fast unto the former, and flee from the latter." Just to make sure you are understanding this rather convoluted paragraph, I've summarized it here. The last statement stated, "They therefore naturally hold fast unto the former, and flee from the latter." To clarify what the former and the latter are, I've separated them here. The former statements that the foolish leaders hold fast to are in the column on the left. That is, the foolish leaders vainly imagine the door of knowledge to be closed and the showers of mercy to be stilled. They cling to idle fancy. They have strayed far from the sure handle, of divine knowledge. Their hearts seem not to be inclined to knowledge and the door thereof, neither think they of its manifestations, inasmuch as idle fancy they have found the door that leadeth unto earthly riches. And the latter statement is the manifestation of the revealer of knowledge, the manifestation of God. They, the foolish leaders, find not but the call to self-sacrifice, from which the foolish leaders flee, and that is what's in the latter category. And that's what they flee from, is this manifestation of the revealer of knowledge. In other words, they reject the divine manifestation of God and reject the call to self-sacrifice. The foolish leaders do not wish to have to sacrifice anything for God or anyone else. So, were these prophecies fulfilled spiritually or symbolically rather than strictly literally? I think it's been shown that spiritually the sun was darkened, and the moon failed to show its light. The stars of heaven did fall to earth, the worldly over the heavenly. It is my opinion that these 3 out of the 4 elements of this verse 29 prophecy have indeed been fulfilled. And this is the last of the 4. The heavenly bodies will be shaken. But first we need to explore the possible answers to the question, what are heavenly bodies, and how can the prophecy, the heavenly bodies will be shaken, be explained in a spiritual or symbolic way? The authoritative writings of the Baha'i faith explain that, quote, all the prophets, meaning the manifestations of God, are lights. They only differ in degree. They shine like brilliant heavenly bodies. Each have their appointed place and time of ascension. Some are like lamps, some like the moon, some like distant stars, and a few are like the sun, shining from one end of the earth to the other. All have the same light to give, yet they are different in degree. End quote. The question then becomes, how will they be shaken? Well, it's not the actual prophets or manifestations of God of the past that are shaken. They are gone from the earthly scene, obviously, but rather what will be shaken are their faiths, in particular the institutions and power structures of the existing faiths, the spiritual laws of the former dispensations, which are now abrogated by the appearance of the new manifestation of God, and traditions that have grown from the above, practice, rituals, and other things like marriage and divorce laws, etc., may be changed by the newest manifestation of God. Islam, in particular, has been shaken. This is because they were the first persecutors of the new manifestations of God, the Bab and Baha'u'llah and their followers, because that's where the Bab and Baha'u'llah first revealed their missions. Their persecution of the followers of the Baha'i faith continues to this very day. Islam has suffered a whole lot of shaking in the last few centuries, including the following: loss of power of the Islamic institutions and clergy. In the Sunni branch, the diminishing and eventual disappearance of the Caliphate, the supreme leadership of the Sunni sect of Islam, never to be re-established. And in the Shia branch, first the secularization of Iran cut the power of the Shia branch of Islam in the 1900s up to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Then, since that revolution, the growing disenchantment, if not disgust, of the Iranian people for the religious leaders. The clergy may still have power, but not the respect and regard of their people. There are earthquakes in religion. There are increasing numbers of sects and divisions in the existing faiths. There's corruption of the clergy becoming involved in politics and the trappings of power wielding, the dimming of the spiritual light of faith in the believers of all the faiths, an increasingly secular world, and the injection of human beliefs and misunderstandings counter to the original teachings of the pure faiths in all the existing faiths. Many, but not all, members of the existing faiths appear to be causing increasing division and animosity between humans on our one and only planet instead of trying to bring us together. All the major faiths have their own version of the Golden Rule, but so many of their followers have forgotten it, indeed preach and or act contrary to that spiritual law of God. I do have a video on the Golden Rule, and it's titled The Golden Rule, It's the Law. You can find it on my video channel on YouTube. My channel name is Integral Destiny 9. At last, we've covered both the literal and the symbolic meanings of verse 29 and how it's been fulfilled in both ways. So we can move on to verse 30. Verse 30, quote, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Note that after all the events of verse 29 occurred, then will appear, and it goes on from there. So we now know that there's a sequence of events here. Note that there are two phases of this prophecy that will occur after all that distress or oppression. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. First, let's examine the heavenly terms that are being used, such as those in this list. Will appear the sign of, Son of Man, in heaven, clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. We'll start with the terms in heaven and Son of Man. This verse is from the book of John, chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Note that Jesus is speaking here. Quote, "I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man." End quote. Note that some Bible versions state man who is in heaven. The Messiah, the Divine Spirit, is the Son of Man. Now for John chapter 6, verse 38, and Jesus is speaking here, quote, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me." End quote. Again, Jesus stated that he came down from heaven. In this case, the people who knew his parents and him as a child scoffed because they knew he was born to Mary and did not come from an unknown place called heaven. And he definitely did not come down out of the sky. Jesus is saying that he, the Messiah, the Son of Man, came from heaven, although we all know the story of how he was born to Mary. So it must be something other than his physical body that came from heaven, or down from heaven in some translations, or in Luke or Mark. Another verse that Jesus spoke, John chapter 4, verse 24, again quoting Jesus, "God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." End quote. So remember, God is a spirit, not material. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, and remember, Paul is the author of these letters, quote, "The light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." End quote. Jesus the Christ was the image of God. Let's take a journey down a logical path. God is a spirit, per the Bible verse we reviewed. Jesus Christ is the image of God, and the Bible also directly refers to him as the Spirit. Therefore, Christ the Messiah is a spirit. His spirit is the image of God, not his physical body. His spirit is what came from heaven, a place of the spirit, not from a physical place on or above the earth. That is how Jesus the Christ can be on earth and in heaven at the same time. He was speaking not of the location of his body, but rather the location or state of his spirit. The Son of Man will appear from heaven. Just as Jesus the Christ came from heaven in the first advent, he would come from heaven in the second advent. In other words, the returned Christ Spirit would return as a spirit from God, the image of God, in or associated with a human physical body, but it would be another human body, not the former body of Jesus, and he would have a new name. Regarding the phrase, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven," it means that a sign will signal the coming of the Messiah returned, but this sign would be in heaven. So we will have to discuss what a possible sign might be, and included in that, what does "in heaven" mean? And whether this sign of his coming in the second advent will be literally a sign of in the literal heaven, meaning in the sky, or will this sign be symbolic or spiritual in nature, or both? What were the signs before the appearance of Jesus the Christ, you might ask? Actually, there were both literal and symbolic signs to signal that the Messiah would soon appear, for those who could see the signs of the times. In the column on the left, the literal sign in the sky, the famous Star of Bethlehem in the sky around the time when Jesus was born. And then, the symbolic sign of the times in the column on the right, the appearance of the prophesied Elijah figure, who was John the Baptist, who announced the imminent appearance of the Messiah, who was Jesus in this case. Just a reminder, the Bab, the Elijah figure of the returned Messiah, has already come. In 1844, he announced his identity and station as the forerunner of the soon-to-appear Messiah. Note the Bab was an independent manifestation of God, too. He even revealed his own holy book. His followers were called Babis. The singular is Babi. And those Babis later became Baha'is when Baha'u'lláh revealed that he was the Messiah. If the Bab was a manifestation of God, and the Lamb prophesied in the book of Revelation, by the way, what were the signs of his appearance? This timeline may look familiar. The events listed at the bottom are entered on the timeline. Comets, the most commonly thought of signs in the heavens, one might expect from what the prophecy states, are shown as red vertical lines and letters on the timeline, and in the red font in the legend. This is not an exhaustive list of comets during this period. The more I dived into researching the topic, the more comets I found. There are some comets during this period that I've not listed here, and there were some comets discovered in the 1800s that then were never seen again. They may have not even been put on the record. But here's what I've noted of the potential of signs in the heavens foretelling the appearances of the Bab and Baha'u'lláh. You can go through and look at them, and I will be noting a couple events in a couple more slides here. Note that starfalls are noted in the blue font in the legend. And note that the Bab was martyred in July of 1850, and Baha'u'lláh had his revelation experience in the late 1852, wherein he was told in a heavenly vision that he was the one the Bab foretold as being him whom God shall make manifest, meaning the Messiah of the latter days. The signs of Matthew chapter 24, the darkening of the sun and moon, falling stars, literally the starfall of 1833, etc., that were already discussed earlier in this presentation, were some of these literal heavenly signs, and the Great Comet of 1843, which was a supremely unique comet in that it was so bright that it was seen in the daytime and it had an enormous tail. It was first seen in February of 1843 and for 5 weeks until April 8, 1843. The Bab made his proclamation in May of 1844, if you recall. And remember, the Bab's announcement was also the announcement of the coming of the Messiah of the latter days, because that's what the Bab said he was sent to do, to let people know the Messiah would shortly appear. Another comet, Bahá'u'llah's comet. It became one of the most unique comets ever observed. It split into 2 comets sometime between 1842 and 1845. It reappeared in 1852 at the time that the Messiah, Baha'u'llah, was thrown into prison because he was then a follower of the Bab, his forerunner, who had been martyred in July of 1850. Baha'u'llah received his revelation from God while he was in that prison in late 1852, when Bahá'u'llah's comet was noted as having divided into 2. The starfall of 1833 was a super-intensive meteor shower and was one of the signs many Christians touted as a sign of the return of Christ, adding to the fervor of the Adventist movement happening in Europe and the USA. Then the starfall of 1866, which was a bit less intensive than the 1833 event, which Baha'u'llah himself said was a sign of his coming, the one in 1866. There have been some theories presented that the Star of Bethlehem was really a great conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn, like 4 to 6 years before the birth of Jesus, giving the Magi some time to get to Bethlehem from their home country. Note that this is a theory and not absolutely proven to be the case. What about one or more of these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions occurring around 1844 or 1863? So I did some investigation to find out if there were any. There were 5 great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in the 1800s. On July 16, 1802, June 18, 1821, January 26, 1842, October 20, 1861, April 17, 1881. Obviously, the dates January of 1842, 16 months before the advent of the Bab, and October 20th, 1861, a year and a half before the great announcement by Baha'u'llah in April of 1863, would both easily fit the scenario of these conjunctions being those signs in the heavens signaling the advent of the Messiah foretold by Jesus. Therefore, as far as literal fulfillment of this clause of verse 30, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, this has been fulfilled in several different ways. Done. Next, how this part of verse 30 was fulfilled spiritually or symbolically as opposed to literal fulfillment. What were the heavenly signs of the forerunner's coming? Before the appearance of the Bab, the gate, there were 2 men who, in succession, proclaimed the imminent appearance of the promised one of Islam, the Mahdi, who is also the foretold Elijah figure who would come before the Messiah to the Jews and Christians. These persons were Sheikh Ahmad, he was born in 1753 and died in 1834. Then Syed Kazim, Ahmad's successor, who died in 1843. One of the last actions of Syed Kazim before he died in 1843 was that he sent some of his students out on a quest to find the Promised One. One of these students did find the Promised One. He was the first person to whom the Bab made his first proclamation of being the Promised One, the Mahdi, the forerunner of the Messiah. Note that the Bab is also the Lamb prophesied in the book of Revelation. These were the signs of the appearance of the Bab to announce his coming. The literal signs on the left in the blue column, and the spiritual signs from heaven are in the column on the right, the green column. The literal signs you can see on the left, the star fall of 1833, then the 1815 explosion of Mount Tambora. Note that the Tambora volcano eruption signals both the Bab and Baha'u'llah's appearances, as does the Great Comet of 1843. Anything literal or symbolic that signals the appearance of the Bab would signal the coming of Baha'u'llah too, since the Bab appeared as the Elijah figure for Baha'u'llah's revelation. Then there's the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in January of 1842. Now on the right are the spiritual or symbolic signs from heaven. Those were the appearances of and the teachings about the imminent coming of the Promised One, proclaimed for at least 10 years in advance of the coming of the Bab by Sheikh Ahmad, Syed Kazim, and their students who went out in search of the Promised One. And these are the heavenly signs to announce the coming of Baha'u'llah. In the column on the left are some of the literal signs in the heavens of the coming of the Messiah, Baha'u'llah. The 1815 eruption and its effects from the explosion of Mount Tambora, which also caused the dark days, and which occurred 2 years before the birth of Baha'u'llah and about 4 years before the birth of the Bab. The Great Comet of 1843, it was a heavenly sign of the coming of the Bab. As I mentioned, since the Bab was the herald of Baha'u'llah, it was also a heavenly sign of the coming of Baha'u'llah too. Biela's Comet of 1852, that was the comet that split into 2 parts, and its splitting into 2 was especially symbolic of the 2 divine beings that had appeared on earth, the Bab, who had already been martyred in 1850, and the fact that Baha'u'llah's revelation was made known to him in late 1852, thus being the second part of the comet, in symbolism, that is. The conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in October 1861, Baha'u'llah publicly declared his divine identity and mission in April of 1863. This conjunction was the literal sign of his coming. Then the Great Comet of 1861. This comet and the 2 following, occurring in 1861 and 62, could be the heavenly signs of this historic and much anticipated public declaration of the Messiah of the latter days. Then we have the star fall of 1866. This occurred while Baha'u'llah was under house arrest by the Ottoman Empire in the city of Adrianople, now called Edirne. Baha'u'llah himself identified this event as the foretold starfall of Matthew chapter 24. In the column on the right is the spiritual or symbolic sign from heaven. That heavenly sign was the appearance of the Bab, who was the Elijah figure to the new Messiah to come, just as John the Baptist was to Jesus. The Bab forewarned humanity for the 6 years of his earthly ministry of the upcoming appearance of what he referred to as him whom God shall make manifest, meaning the Messiah to all humanity for this new era promised by Jesus. All the heavenly activity in the early, mid, and later 1800s, before and during the revelations of both the Bab and Baha'u'llah, have definitely been fulfilled by both literal events in the sky and the heavenly or spiritual events announcing their imminent appearance. Status: fulfilled. Now we continue with the explanation of verse 30 of chapter 24. The second part of verse 30 of Matthew chapter 24, quote, "And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory," end quote. First, we will concentrate on answering this question. Why would all the peoples of the earth mourn the coming of the Messiah? Notice that it says all the peoples of the earth would mourn. Wouldn't they be happy that the Messiah had come? From the writings of Baha'u'lláh, the new Messiah, it explains the result of the oppression from corrupted religion, meaning the mourning by all the peoples of the earth. Quote, "These words signify that in those days men will lament the loss of the sun of divine beauty, of the moon of knowledge, and of the stars of divine wisdom." End quote. In other words, the peoples of the earth will feel the effects of the oppression mentioned earlier in this presentation. This quote also explains the symbolic meaning of Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, about the darkening of the sun, the dimming of the moon, and the falling of the stars, meaning the darkening of the religious leaders and the dimming of the laws of the previous religions. Then the question we must answer is, have the peoples of the earth mourned or lamented the loss of the sun of divine beauty, etc.? Leading up to the 1800s and since, the religious faiths on earth have suffered further splintering of the faiths into even more disparate sects, further corruption in the institutions and clergy of all the existing faiths, further sectarianism, people leaving organized faiths because of perceived problems within them. Many have become concerned in the rising number of what are called nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who, when asked about what religion they practice, they reply none. Segments of the faiths becoming fanatical and or political, often resulting in further divisiveness and even sometimes violence towards those who do not agree. Weakening of adherence to the laws of the religions, introduction of human interpretations or practices that are not fully conforming to the religious laws or even are directly contrary to them. The faith may become more form than substance. Recent events such as sexual abuse of children by the clergy, clergy of some faiths becoming politically involved to the detriment of the teaching of the true faith they profess. People sense that their faith, and all the existing faiths on earth, is in need of change or renewal. Thus they mourn for the original pure faith before it became sullied by the machinations and changes introduced by human beings. Do you sense a need for some renewal in your organized religion? Do you mourn for the condition of spiritual life on this planet at this time? Don't you think we are past due for a manifestation of God to appear with a fresh message from God? As to the clause, they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Something to think about as we go through the explanation of this clause. Keep in mind the language in this verse. It says we would see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, not the clouds of earth. The literal meanings of clouds or clouds of earth are in the left column. The spiritual or symbolic meanings of the clouds of heaven are in the column on the right. Literal clouds on the left, water vapor. In the sky, they're clouds. On the surface, they're fog. Clouds provide rain, lightning, thunder, snow, blizzards, tornadoes, the good and bad of weather systems. Other than tornadoes or high winds, literal clouds cannot physically hold up objects the size or weight of a man. If a man were in a tornado or such forceful winds that could pick him up, it would most likely result in his being smashed into some object at such high speed that it would be fatal. Now, the symbolic meanings of clouds in the right column include that which surrounds or envelops one, like fog, but not literal fog. Clouds obscure or interfere with the ability to discern one's spiritual surroundings. The old saying, "cloud your judgment," springs to mind. Clouds, these symbolic clouds, provide rain from heaven, symbolic of the water of life, meaning the spiritual guidance and teachings that come from God through his prophets. Hold on, there's another kind of literal cloud that the Bab and Baha'u'llah have appeared upon. Ever heard of cloud computing? Cloud computing is, per Investopedia.com, quote, the delivery of different services through the internet. These resources include tools and applications like data storage, servers, databases, networking, and software, end quote. For short, it's the cloud of the internet. The Bab and Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith have been on the cloud of the internet for many, many years and have been expanding on that medium. You can find them there. Details on how to access information about them, their writings, teachings, and the Baha'i faith on the internet is given at the end of this video. A question arises from the literal interpretation of the Messiah descending from the sky on a cloud. Of what purpose would God have, or the Messiah have, in literally coming down out of the sky on a cloud? Answer: no one would doubt that the Messiah had come, would they? But God has never made it that easy for us. He has always tested his servants to discern the real believer from the false. It always required us to make decisions to do the work. This no-brainer scenario of the coming of the Messiah would not help humans learn to spiritually discern the true from the false. It would be like you did your child's homework all the time. You would not be doing your child any favors. He has learned nothing from the homework that you did. I can't help but ask a further question. Why didn't Moses or Jesus come that way in the first place? No one would have doubted their being from God then. Or would they? Same answer as above, basically. God is not interested in shortcuts that do not force us, his creation, to grow spiritually. And knowing we humans as we do, you know that some will not believe their eyes, even if he did come down out of the sky. If a person was asleep when he came down on a literal cloud, even if a person saw a video of it, one could easily believe it was just another special effects or faked video. What about the symbolic meaning of rain from heaven? Here is a very logical explanation of what one of the meanings of the clouds of heaven is. This is from the sacred writings of the Baha'i faith written by Baha'u'llah. Quote, consider the past. How many, both high and low, have at all times yearningly awaited the advent of the manifestations of God in the sanctified persons of his chosen ones. How often have they expected his coming? How frequently have they prayed that the breeze of divine mercy would blow and the promised beauty step forth from behind the veil of concealment and be made manifest to all the world. And whensoever the portals of grace did open and the clouds of divine bounty did rain upon mankind, and the light of the unseen did shine above the horizon of the celestial might, they all denied him and turned away from his face, the face of God himself. Refer ye, to verify this truth, to that which hath been recorded in every sacred book. End quote. That phrase, the clouds of divine bounty did rain upon mankind, is not referring to real rain, obviously. It is the heavenly rain of the bounties of the divine spirit. Here is another quote from the writings of Baha'u'llah that explains another meaning. Quote, thus it is that through the rise of these luminaries of God, the world is made new. The waters of everlasting life stream forth. The billows of loving kindness surge. The clouds of grace are gathered, and the breeze of bounty bloweth upon all created things. End quote. And still another quote from Baha'u'llah. Quote, by this is meant that the divine beauty will be made manifest from the heaven of the will of God, and will appear in the form of the human temple. The term heaven denoteth loftiness and exaltation, inasmuch as it is the seat of the revelation of those manifestations of holiness, the daysprings of ancient glory. These ancient beings, though delivered from the womb of their mother, have in reality descended from the heaven of the will of God. Though they be dwelling on this earth, yet their true habitations are the retreats of glory in the realms above. Whilst walking amongst mortals, they soar in the heaven of the divine presence. Without feet they tread the path of the Spirit, and without wings they arise unto the exalted heights of divine unity. With every fleeting breath they cover the immensity of space, and at every moment traverse the kingdoms of the visible and the invisible. Upon their thrones is written, "Nothing whatsoever keepeth him from being occupied with any other thing." And on their seats is inscribed, "Verily his ways differ every day." They are sent forth through the transcendent power of the Ancient of Days, and are raised up by the exalted will of God, the most mighty King. This is what is meant by the words, "coming in the clouds of heaven." End quote. Next, that last part of verse 30 of Matthew 24, where it states that the Son of Man would be coming with power and great glory. It leads us to ask the question, what kind of power and glory might we expect from the new Messiah, the Messiah of the latter days? I think we should start with asking another question. What kind of power and glory did Jesus Christ display? Both would be from God, and the Bible spoke of the glory of Jesus Christ. The New Testament is full of verses that spoke of the glory of Jesus, yet he was without worldly power or the glorification of social position. That's one of the reasons why most Jews did not accept him as the Messiah. Jesus did not command an army and was powerless to save the Jews from their subjugation by the Romans. Jesus did not literally fulfill the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah, who the Jews thought would wield a sword and save his people from Roman rule. We all know that Jesus was glorified by God and by the worship of his followers, yet he died, to outward appearances, a humiliating death. But his glory was not derived from earthly power or wealth. He led no literal army. The swords the prophets of God wield are their words. The swords that come out of their mouths is symbolic for their heavenly teachings. The power and glory of the manifestations of God come from the power of the Holy Spirit, not from physical brute strength. The battles the returned Christ would face would be against the disbelief of powerful entities, just as Jesus the Christ faced. A side remark here on the topic of swords in prophecy. Many people assume that the word sword in a prophecy automatically means that there will be violence, blood, war, misery. But this verse from the book of Revelation, chapter 19, verse 15, which is specifically speaking of the coming of the new Messiah, the returned Christ Spirit, quote, "And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God." End quote. It's obvious that the sword coming out of the mouth of the Messiah are his words, his teachings that will conquer the nations. And also, FYI, a rod of iron is a means of measuring, of judging something against a standard of behavior. An iron rod isn't a weapon to strike people with. Iron depicts strength and endurance. This measuring rod of the new Messiah will be strong and endure for a long time. So the power and glory of the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ Spirit, will come from his words, his teachings, and the long duration and strength of his dispensation and covenant. Now, back to clouds. Literal-minded prophecy buffs have added together this prophecy of the Messiah coming from heaven on clouds and the verses from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17 that you see here. Quote, For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." End quote. So we get the theory of the rapture, where Jesus is supposed to literally come down out of the sky on a cloud, resurrect the dead physical bodies who were professed Christians in life, and then will take them up into the literal sky, up into the air with him. Next, about the use of the word air. What is the word air in heavenly terms? Well, the translation is from the original Greek text of the word aera in the Bible. However, another correct translation is atmosphere. Here is an example of the use of the word atmosphere by the new Messiah for the new age, Baha'u'lláh. Quote, "Know thou that he is truly learned who hath acknowledged my revelation, and drunk from the ocean of my knowledge, and soared in the atmosphere of my love, and cast away all else beside me, and taken firm hold on that which hath been sent down from the kingdom of my wondrous utterance. He verily is even as an eye unto mankind, and as the spirit of life unto the body of all creation." End quote. Here Baha'u'lláh speaks of the soul soaring into the atmosphere of God's love. I believe that Jesus had been talking to his followers about this type of soaring, not bodily being picked up off the face of the earth, but rather this type of soaring into the atmosphere of God's love. A spiritual condition, not a physical one. Also, notice at the bottom where he says, "the spirit of life unto the body of all creation." Remember the verse about the dead in Christ rising first? And this is yet another example from the writings of Baha'u'lláh, wherein he mentions soaring towards God in this day. Quote, "This is the day on which the bird of utterance hath warbled its melody upon the branches, in the name of its Lord, the God of mercy. Blessed is the man that hath, on the wings of longing, soared towards God, the Lord of the judgment day." End quotes. This is spiritual soaring, not going up into the sky. So you will have to make a decision as to what makes more spiritual sense of the translation and use of this Greek word aero. Bodily soaring into the sky versus soaring into the atmosphere of God's love. Now we come to the part of the prophecy where it states, "The dead in Christ will rise first." Rise to what? Rise to go up into the sky, or rise to soar in the atmosphere of the love of God brought by the new Messiah, per our discussion about the proper translation of the Greek word aero? My answer is obvious, the answer that is most logical. Those who would not be followers of Jesus the Christ will be the first to recognize the new Messiah when he comes, before Christians would. So the dead in Christ are those who are not followers of Jesus. The new Messiah would first be accepted by people who were not Christians, the dead in Christ. Fulfillment of this verse came about when the Bab and Baha'u'lláh appeared in the mostly Muslim land of Persia, and their first believers were primarily Muslims, not Christians. But Christians, like me, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, tribal faiths, and others all over the globe have followed and become believers too, and thus entered the atmosphere of God's wisdom and love, meaning we followers of Baha'u'lláh were raptured. After all that oppression, formerly termed tribulation, now called distress in the New International Version of the Bible, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, fulfilled. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Fulfilled. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Fulfilled. Will be caught with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Fulfilled when Baha'u'llah's followers recognized and responded spiritually to the new revelation from God. They soared in the atmosphere of God's love, in other words. So far, all verses of prophecy are fulfilled. On to verse 31, quote, "And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." End quote. We will begin by discussing the loud trumpet call that announced the coming of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. This map again, showing the location of the largest, loudest blast that humankind has heard and put on the record, that of the loud blast of the explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, just before the births of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. The blast was so loud it was heard 1,400 miles away. Recall that the volcanic ash spewed into the atmosphere resulted in some dark days throughout much of South Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and even into North America. The ash in the atmosphere resulted in Europe in the year 1816 that was called the Year Without Summer because it was so cold all summer. That was a literal trumpet call. Another type of trumpet call was the second and third Great Awakenings in the Christian world in the early 1800s and mid to late 1800s respectively. With the third Great Awakening, it included the Advent movement, when expectations of the return of Christ became so loud and as insistent trumpet calls, primarily among Protestants. Many thousands of people became convinced that the time prophecies in the books of Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 4, and Revelation chapter 11 proved that the Messiah was to return in 1844. Note some of the first calculations foretold the year 1843, but people had not remembered that there is no year zero between the BC dates and the AD dates. Therefore, these first calculations were wrong. The corrected date was, for most of these prophecy fans, was 1844. For a more detailed explanation of why the year 1844 is pinpointed as the year of the coming of the Messiah, see my video titled "Christ Has Returned," which is focused on Bible time prophecies of the appearance of the Messiah of the latter days. Who made these predictions of the imminent appearance of the returned Christ? Here's a list of some of them. And by the way, the dates of after each name are their dates of birth and death. I won't read them to you, just want you to understand how many people studied this 2300-day prophecy in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, and figured out that the end point would be in the early to mid 1840s. Of special note is the one with the yellow arrows pointing to it to the bottom right. That is William Miller, a farmer and Bible prophecy scholar from Vermont and New York states. He is of special note because of the many thousands of people that came to follow him, and others who came to also study the prophecies and also came out with the dates 1843 to 1844 as when Christ would return. William Miller was so important in the Advent movement that his story and his followers, the Millerites, will be briefly told in the next few slides. William Miller's study of the Bible, after much prayer and devotion, led to his discovery of the meaning of the 2300-day or 2300-year prediction in Daniel. His preaching about the imminent return of Christ started the Millerite movement. He traveled the country teaching of the coming of the second advent of Christ. As mentioned, his large body of followers came to be called the Millerites. He first predicted the return was to occur in 1843, then realized his math error because there is no year 0 in the calendars. Then he predicted March 21st, 1844 would be the day, probably because that was the first day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which would have made it 2300 years exactly since Daniel made that prediction. When nothing happened that day, he changed it to October 22nd, 1844, for reasons unknown. On the expected date and time of March 21st, 1844, thousands assembled throughout the United States, Europe, and some other places throughout the world to await Christ's return down from the sky. Christ did not show up as expected. And then same thing for the October 22nd date that he subsequently foretold Christ would come on. Christ didn't show up then either. Christ not coming down from the sky with literal trumpets blaring for the whole world to see was a huge letdown and became known as the Great Disappointment. Just a thought. Why do you suppose he didn't show up? Was the Bible wrong, do you think? Something has bothered me since I first read about the Millerites and their huge disappointment. They're standing on the mountains and hills awaiting his coming down out of the sky, only to be so excruciatingly disappointed. But then why did no one go out in search of someone in the world having declared that he was the promised one? The Millerites and all the others going to and fro in the Christian world, loudly proclaiming the imminent return of the Messiah, and for everyone to get prepared, was the trumpet call announcing the coming of the Messiah. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, expectations were very high and hopeful for the great announcement and the resurrection. The Sunnis were expecting the appearances of the Mahdi and the return of Christ, and the Shia branch of Islam in Persia and eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire were vehemently awaiting the Qaim, who was also the Mahdi and the 12th Imam, and the return of Imam Hussein. This loud clamoring throughout the Muslim world, especially in the Shia areas, was the trumpet call of the Messiah to the Muslim world, that he would soon appear. Thus, the trumpet call was loud and clear in all those areas of the world as well. Now, I referred to these examples here as being literal fulfillment of the trumpet call prophecy. But I think there's an argument that they're symbolic. So it might be either, both, neither. Now for some examples of what the spiritual meanings of trumpet call are. These examples are from the sacred writings of Baha'u'llah. Let's go back to that verse 31 where it states, "And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call." What is a trumpet in the heavenly language of the Spirit, known as God? The sounding of trumpets is used throughout the Old Testament to preface important announcements, such as at the temple or other religious observations. The Bible has frequently used the term trumpet or the sounding of a trumpet to signify a revelation from God through a manifestation of God. An example in Revelation chapter 1 verses 10 and 11, quote, "I, John, was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a great voice, as of a trumpet, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last." End quote. This verse quotes the Spirit of the Messiah as he gave the vision to John of Patmos, who then wrote it down in the book of Revelation. When John heard the Messiah talking, it sounded like a trumpet. And more regarding trumpets from Joel chapter 2 verse 1, quote, "Blow ye the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand." End quote. The day of the Lord is the coming of a new manifestation of God, and the use of the trumpet sounding is symbolic of the announcement of the appearance of the King of existence. And this quote from the writings of Baha'u'llah explains about the trumpet blowing. Quote, "By him who is the great announcement, the all-merciful is come, invested with undoubted sovereignty. The balance hath been appointed, and all them that dwell on earth have been gathered together. The trumpet hath been blown, and lo, all eyes have stared up with terror, and the hearts of all who are in the heavens and on the earth have trembled, except them whom the breaths of the verses of God hath quickened, and who have detached themselves from all things. This is the day whereon the earth shall tell out her tidings. The workers of iniquity are her burdens, could ye but perceive it. The moon of idle fancy hath been cleft, and the heaven hath given out a palpable smoke. We see the people laid low, awed with the dread of thy Lord, the Almighty, the most powerful. The crier hath cried out, and men have been torn away, so great hath been the fury of his wrath. The people of the left hand sigh and bemoan. The people of the right abide in noble habitations. They quaff the wine that is life indeed from the hands of the all-merciful, and are verily the blissful. The crier hath cried out is basically the same thing as a trumpet call. The crier announces special events. Note that the people of the left hand and people of the right are mentioned. Note this has nothing to do with political right and left labels. In Matthew chapter 25, Christ mentions that when the Messiah returns, he will judge the people by their responses to his claims and teachings. He said that those who treat him and his followers, referred to as the least of these, treat them well. They feed and clothe him and care for his followers, will be his sheep and will be put on his right side as he sits on his throne of glory. And those who treat him and his followers poorly will be goats and will be relegated to his left side and ultimately are referred to as cursed. Here's a quote about the goats. Quote, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." End quote. This is from Matthew chapter 25, verses 41 through 46. So here in this writing of Baha'u'llah, he is stating that when the crier cried out, meaning the Bab and his followers, spread the message of the coming of the Messiah, but the people, for the most part, ignored the Bab's teachings and warnings, and Baha'u'llah's after him. The people of the left hand were those who have ignored the most recent messengers from God, thus incur the displeasure of God. The people of the right, who have accepted their Lord, abide in noble habitation, meaning they abide in the pleasure of the Lord. And as the last part of this quote stated, the people who recognize him, those people of the right hand, will quaff the wine that is life indeed from the hands of the all-merciful and are verily the blissful. The next two slides will show an excerpt from Baha'u'llah's writings out of the book called Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah. It is a description of what will happen to the true seeker who experiences the trumpet blast of knowledge from the new manifestation of God. Quote, "Only when the lamp of search, of earnest striving, of longing desire, of passionate devotion, of fervid love, of rapture and ecstasy, is kindled within the seeker's heart, and the breeze of his loving kindness is wafted upon his soul, will the darkness of error be dispelled, the mists of doubts and misgivings be dissipated, and the lights of knowledge and certitude envelop his being. At that hour will the mystic herald, bearing the joyful tidings of the Spirit, shine forth from the city of God, resplendent as the morn, and through the trumpet blast of knowledge will awaken the heart, the soul, and the spirit from the slumber of heedlessness. Then will the manifold favors and outpouring grace of the Holy and Everlasting Spirit confers such new life upon the seeker that he will find himself endowed with a new eye, a new ear, a new heart, and a new mind. He will contemplate the manifest signs of the universe and will penetrate the hidden mysteries of the soul. Gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. He will discover in all things the mysteries of divine revelation and the evidences of an everlasting manifestation." End quote. We also have to discuss what an angel is in regards to this phrase, "and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call." What are angels? Baha'u'llah explains, quote, "And now concerning his," Jesus' words, "and he shall send his angels." By angels is meant those who, reinforced by the power of the Spirit, have consumed with the fire of the love of God all human traits and limitations, and have clothed themselves with the attributes of the most exalted beings and of the cherubim." End quote. From the book The Prophecies of Jesus by Michael Sowers, in a footnote on page 132, the author points out the meaning of the term cherubim. Quote, "In the Bible, the term cherubim signifies beings who are possibly of a high order of angels and who, in some instances, accompany the presence of God." End quote. And from the pen of Baha'u'llah, quote, "And now, inasmuch as these holy beings have sanctified themselves from every human limitation, have become endowed with the attributes of the spiritual, and have been adorned with the noble traits of the blessed, they therefore have been designated as angels." End quote. Note that the holy beings are those who arose at the first revealing of the new manifestation of God, and devoted themselves to that person and his message, just as the disciples of Jesus and his followers when he walked the earth. Only these would be the disciples and early believers in the returned Messiah. And this last clause of verse 31, quote, "And they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." End quote. Just as Jesus told his disciples and followers to teach his gospels, to spread the good news and become fishers of men, the new Messiah also sent his sanctified disciples and followers, his angels, out to announce the glad tidings and to find spiritually receptive souls, the elect, in all areas on the earth. Who are the elect? These elect are those who became the followers of the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah. They came from all directions on this globe, east, west, north, and south, meaning the entire planet. Currently there are more than 10 million followers of the Baha'i faith, now residing in over 200 nations and territories on earth, in just 178 years or so since 1844. This diverse community of believers are unified in their love of God and his messengers for this age. Note the general meaning of the term "the elect" is not an exclusive club limited only to a certain type or types of people, or just to Baha'is. And just because one is a Baha'i, it doesn't ensure that you are among the elect. It depends upon the spiritual attributes one has acquired in this life. The Baha'i writings state that the elect of humanity are those who live together in love and unity. They are preferable before God because the divine attributes are already manifest in them. Therefore, verse 31 is fulfilled. To close out the explanations of how the events in and around the lives of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the beginning of the Baha'i faith fulfill the prophecies in Matthew 24 through verse and including verse 31, I'll share with you an excerpt from Baha'u'llah's writings on the fulfillment of these prophecies in the following several slides. Quote, "Among others, these perspicuous verses have, in answer to certain individuals, been sent down from the kingdom of divine knowledge. O thou who hast set thy face towards the splendors of my countenance. Vague fancies have encompassed the dwellers of the earth and debarred them from turning towards the horizon of certitude and its brightness and its manifestations and its lights. Vain imaginings have withheld them from him who is the self-subsisting. They speak as prompted by their own caprices, and understand not. Among them are those who have said, Have the verses been sent down? Say, Yea, by him who is the Lord of the heavens. Hath the hour come? Nay, more, it hath passed, by him who is the revealer of clear tokens. Verily the inevitable is come, and he, the true one, hath appeared with proof and testimony. The plain is disclosed, and mankind is sore vexed and fearful. Earthquakes have broken loose, and the tribes have lamented for fear of God, the Lord of strength, the all-compelling. Say, the stunning trumpet blast hath been loudly raised, and the day is God's, the one, the unconstrained. Hath the catastrophe come to pass? Say, Yea, by the Lord of lords. Is the resurrection come? Nay, more, he who is the self-subsisting hath appeared with the kingdom of his signs. Seest thou men laid low? Yea, by my Lord the exalted, the Most High. Have the tree stumps been uprooted? Yea, more, the mountains have been scattered in dust, by him the Lord of attributes. They say, Where is paradise, and where is hell? Say, the one is reunion with me, the other thine own self, O thou who dost associate a partner with God and doubtest. They say, We see not the balance. Say, surely by my Lord, the God of mercy, none can see it except such as are endued with insight. Have the stars fallen? Say, Yea, when he who is the self-subsisting dwelt in the land of mystery, meaning Adrianople in 1866. Take heed, ye who are endued with discernment. All the signs appeared when we drew forth the hand of power from the bosom of majesty and might. Verily the crier hath cried out, when the promised time came, and they that have recognized the splendors of Sinai have swooned away in the wilderness of hesitation before the awful majesty of thy Lord, the Lord of creation. The trumpet asketh, Hath the bugle been sounded? Say, Yea, by the King of revelation, when he mounted the throne of his name, the all-merciful. Darkness hath been chased away by the dawning light of the mercy of thy Lord, the source of all light. The breeze of the all-merciful hath wafted, and the souls have been quickened in the tombs of their bodies. Thus hath the decree been fulfilled by God, the mighty, the beneficent. They that have gone astray have said, When were the heavens cleft asunder? Say, while ye lay in the graves of waywardness and error. Among the heedless is he who rubbeth his eyes and looketh to the right and to the left. Say, blinded art thou, no refuge hast thou to flee to. And among them is he who saith, Have men been gathered together? Say, Yea, by my Lord, whilst thou did lie in the cradle of idle fancies. And among them is he who saith, Hath the book been sent down through the power of the true faith? Say, the true faith itself is astounded. Fear ye, O ye men of understanding heart. And among them is he who saith, Have I been assembled with others, blind? Say, Yea, by him that rideth upon the clouds. Paradise is decked with mystic roses, and hell hath been made to blaze with the fire of the impious. Say, the light hath shone forth from the horizon of revelation, and the whole earth hath been illumined at the coming of him who is the Lord of the day of the covenant. The doubters have perished, whilst he that turned, guided by the light of assurance, unto the dayspring of certitude hath prospered. Blessed art thou who hast fixed thy gaze upon me, for this tablet which hath been sent down for thee, a tablet which causeth the souls of men to soar. Commit it to memory and recite it. By my life, it is a door to the mercy of thy Lord. Well is it with him that reciteth it at eventide and at dawn. We verily hear thy praise of this cause, through which the mountain of knowledge was crushed, and men's feet have slipped. My glory be upon thee, and upon whomsoever hath turned unto the Almighty, the All-Bounteous. The tablet is ended, but the theme is unexhausted. Be patient, for the Lord is patient. We have finished the review of all the prophetic statements by Jesus in chapter 24 of Matthew. We finished it off by an excerpt of a book written by Baha'u'lláh that touched on his claim that these prophecies of Matthew 24, and some others, were fulfilled by him and his revelation. Next on the agenda is to review Part 5b on the instructions and warnings that Jesus made in chapter 24 to his followers of actions that they should take or should not take to prepare for or in response to the events and conditions he foretold. These are the verses listed in the left column in which these instructions or warnings by Jesus are given. Verse 13, quote, "The one who stands firm to the end of the age will be saved," end quote. Verses 16 through 20, "Those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," and then instructions to others for those who are affected by the abomination in the holy place. Verses 23 through 26, instructions regarding false prophets and messiahs. Verses 32 through 35, lessons from the parable of the fig tree. And then verses 36 through 51, which is the end of chapter 24, watching for the coming of the Son of Man, the Messiah of the Second Advent. So we start with verse 13, quote, "But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved," end quote. We know now that the one who stands firm, being saved, would not be those specific individuals hearing Jesus speak of the future, but would be those at the time of the end of the age, at the appearance, or learning of the appearance of the Messiah of the second coming. That is, those faithful who are watching for the Messiah and know how to recognize him. What does firm to the end mean? It means to stay firm in their faith until the end of the age, as the book of Daniel revealed, as we reviewed at the beginning of part 1 of this video set. In other words, until 1844. They could then find the true prophet and Messiah, as opposed to the false prophets and messiahs he warned about. People always seem to concentrate on the verses that speak of false prophets and false messiahs. But how do we find the true Messiah? Remember, Jesus speaking about these false prophets and messiahs was in the middle, in the context of his giving of prophecies of how and when the true Messiah, the true prophet, would appear. As mentioned before, we follow the instructions given in Matthew chapter 7 as follows. These are the instructions of how to find the true Messiah and how to differentiate true from false. So I'm not going to read this to you because this was covered in part 1 of this 2-part video series. Just note the bottom line of verse 20. By their fruit you will recognize them. Another thing you can do is investigate the southwest area of Persia, that's modern-day Iran, for evidence of people who claimed prophethood, since that is where the Bible said God would set his throne in the latter days. See Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 38 and 39, shown here at the bottom, quote, "And I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from thence the king and the princes, saith the Lord. But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith the Lord." And note that the Bab was born and made his first declaration of his divine identity in Elam, in southwest Persia. And you should search in the Holy Land, in the vicinity of Mount Carmel and Sharon, since that is where the Bible said in Isaiah would see the glory of God, or the glory of the Lord. Hint, that's Baha'u'llah. And remember, the English translation of the name Baha'u'llah is the glory of God. Why the area of Mount Carmel and Sharon? Because that's what the Bible said in Isaiah chapter 35 verse 2 would be the location of the glory of the Lord when he comes. Quote, "The splendor of Carmel and Sharon, they shall see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God." End quote. Here's a map of the Holy Land that shows the plain of Sharon, that's the green strip along the Mediterranean Sea, and Mount Carmel, north of there, mentioned by Isaiah as seeing the glory of God in the latter days. Baha'u'llah means the glory of God, as I've told you several times, and you're probably tired of me saying that. But it can also be translated as the splendor of God. Now, Baha'u'llah was in the Carmel, Akka, Sharon area for 24 years, from the year 1868 to 1892, and he is also laid to rest in that area. If people had searched for the Messiah in the area of Carmel and Sharon, as the book of Isaiah told them to, they may have found him. But alas, they did not search for him. Please consider the story of the German Templars. Note that these Templars are not the same Templars from the Middle Ages and in the lore of history. These Templars were a group of Germans who sold their worldly goods in Germany and moved to Palestine in the 1860s. They built a small colony at the foot of Mount Carmel in the tiny town of Haifa, specifically to await the Messiah, who they expected to imminently appear in that area because the Bible said that's where he'd appear. Their distinctive buildings had red tile roofs. Some had lintels over their doors stating "Der Herr ist nahe," which is German for "the Lord is near," or similar messages. In this photo, you are looking north, down from Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel, to the base of Mount Carmel in the street that is now named Ben Gurion Avenue. This photo was taken by me in the year 2010 when I was visiting Haifa on Baha'i religious pilgrimage. While taking this photo, I'm standing about midway up Mount Carmel, just below the shrine of the Bab who is buried there. Note the red-roofed buildings along the street. Many, but not all, of these buildings are those original buildings that the German Templars built to await their Lord. The German Templars moved all the way to Palestine to await the appearance of their Lord, the returned Christ, yet they missed him. They never recognized that these people called Baha'is all around them were the followers of the new Messiah that they sought for so long, probably due to prejudices against people they probably thought were Muslims and who also did not look like them or speak German. This is a perfect illustration of human foolishness, and so very sad. This is a photo of the Shrine of the Bab on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. I was standing about here when I took the photo of the German Templar settlement below the shrine that was on the previous slide. This is the final resting place of the Bab and the site of pilgrimages from the followers of the Baha'i faith from all corners of the globe. Next, the instructions in verses 16 through 20. Here we will discuss verses 16 through 20, but we must remind ourselves about what verse 15 means. Quote, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." End quote. We have to remember verse 15 reminds us that Daniel pointed to the time around the year 1844 for the end of the abomination that causes desolation. This abomination that causes desolation is a spiritual devastation to Islam from the usurpation of the divinely inspired desire of Muhammad that leadership of Islam go to his cousin Ali and then Ali's male descendants thereafter. It was usurped by the Umayyad dynasty of Sunni caliphs and their Umayyad clan for 150 years after the death of Muhammad, and then the Abbasid dynasty of caliphs after that. First, let's run through all these verses, 16 through 20. Quote, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath." End quote. The descriptions from Jesus in all these verses speak of extraordinary troubles to come after he has left the earth. The troubles that are listed are almost entirely speaking of physical perils to the body, discomfort, cold, psychological distress perhaps. Here are some key phrases as an illustration of this. Flee to the mountains, no one take anything out of the house, no one go get their cloak, dreadful for pregnant women and nursing mothers, pray, flight not in winter or on the Sabbath, etc. These verses are actually using physical crisis as a metaphor for spiritual crisis. All these verses instruct his followers to respond to the disruption caused by the Umayyad takeover of Islam and the ramifications of that in the societies and other spiritual desolations in their lives by not focusing on the material world, but to concentrate on the spiritual world. He is speaking of detachment from the material world. Now we'll look just at verse 16. Quote, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." End quote. A reminder here, going up to the mountains has been a metaphor throughout the Old Testament for seeking God. And as Michael Sowers explains in his book, The Prophecies of Jesus, quote, "Christ tells his followers to flee to the mountains. The mountains may symbolize the loftiness and firm stronghold of the Word of God. In the Old Testament, the law comes down from the mountain." That's from Exodus chapter 19. Noah's Ark comes to rest upon the mountains. That's Genesis chapter 8, verse 4. The book of Isaiah says, "Let's go up to the mountain," and prophesied that the law will go out from the mountain. That's Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. And in Psalms we read, "His foundation is in the holy mountain." That's Psalm 87, verse 1. In the New Testament, Jesus went up on a mountain and preached from the mount. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. End quote from Michael Sowers. Verses 17 and 18, wherein Jesus warns his flock, quote, "Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak." End quote. Jesus is telling his followers in the midst of spiritual oppression from the errant leadership of Islam to be detached from the material world, to concentrate on the world of the spirit, to leave Judea, the area affected by the wayward leadership of Islam, and respond urgently and take action and realize that their souls were in danger if they do not do the above. Some very important qualifiers here. I am not condemning Islam. What was corrupted was its leadership, especially the Sunni sect who rejected Ali and his male heirs as the leaders of Islam, as Muhammad had directed, but instead chose other people as their leaders. Leadership affects those who are led, of course. So the corrupted leadership of Islam weakened the spiritual power of Islam. However, Muhammad and his holy book, the Quran, were not corrupted. So note the following. Muhammad is a prophet of God. Muhammad was foretold in the Bible as a prophet. The Quran is a true holy book of God. Muslims who live by the holy book of Islam are following the laws of God. It was the leadership of Islam that was corrupted by people of evil intent after the death of Muhammad, not the religion as a whole. Please see this YouTube video of mine titled "The Prophet Muhammad Foretold in the Bible" for the full story of the beginnings of Islam and how this religion of God was corrupted, that is, the leadership was corrupted. It's a spiritual lesson for all of humanity. We need to follow the laws that God's messengers send to us, and that includes the laws of succession each manifestation of God may provide. This video is on my YouTube channel, which is Integral Destiny 9. You can see the URL address here at the bottom. That will take you directly to my channel page on YouTube. Then you have to scroll down to find this video. This video explains several of the books and chapters wherein Muhammad and/or his faith is foretold. Verses 19 and 20, quote, "How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath." End quote. Michael Sowers, in his book The Prophecies of Jesus, has these comments about the meanings of verses 19 and 20, about the coming hardships. Quote, "If understood symbolically, these verses suggest the hardships that must be suffered by the faithful. The believer must remain faithful even when held back by inescapable responsibilities, must struggle at times when it is difficult, and even when tradition, the Sabbath, and the ruling powers prohibit it." End quote. Verse 19 is about pregnant or nursing women, meaning inescapable responsibilities. Verse 20 warns about your flight taking place in winter when times are difficult, or on the Sabbath, meaning against traditions or the ruling powers that might prohibit those actions. The hardships of fleeing in winter symbolizes the difficulty of living the religious life when there is little belief and spirituality. End quote. Again, that's from Michael Sowers as well. We've finished the review of the instructions and warnings by Jesus through verse 20. On to those in verses 23 through 26. On to verses 23 through 26, quote, "At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, 'There he is out in the wilderness,' do not go out, or 'Here he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it." End quote. These verses are another warning about falling for false messiahs and prophets. We've already covered the methods of testing people who claim they are a prophet or a messiah, so you know that Jesus said, "You will know them by their fruits." But that means you must examine their claims and their characters to determine what those fruits, if any, are that the claimants produce. Now, if we look at just this part of the verse, verse 26, quote, "So if anyone tells you, 'There he is out in the wilderness,' do not go out, or 'Here he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it," end quote. Jesus is stating that no prophet or manifestation of God keeps it a secret once he has made a public proclamation of his station. Moses did not hide from Pharaoh or his fellow Hebrews once he took on the mission assigned to him by God. Jesus openly taught his faith, and any who were interested did not have to meet with him secretly. The Sermon on the Mount was proof of that. Muhammad too did not cower in a cave somewhere, even though powerful enemies had sworn to eliminate him and his faith. The returned Messiah would also proclaim his identity out in the open. Verse 26 is telling us that the Messiah of the second coming will openly proclaim his revelation. He will not hide it or sequester it for just a selected few. Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah in the late 1800s, sent tablets to numerous kings and rulers and a pope, telling them of his appearance, identity, and divine purpose. These rulers included Pope Pius IX, Napoleon III, Queen Victoria of Britain, Tsar Alexander II of Russia, Emperor William of Prussia, the King of Persia, the Sultan of Turkey, and some others. He definitely did not keep his identity a secret. We are making progress. Next is to review verses 32 through 35, which are about the parable of the fig tree. Verses 32 and 33 quote, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door." End quote. Jesus again uses a parable to teach his followers through symbolism. According to Michael Sowers in his book, The Prophecies of Jesus, quote, "In this parable of the fig tree, we have an analogy applicable to the changes that will take place in the spiritual life of humankind and in the institutions of religion. Like the seasons, our spiritual life has cycles. This type of decline and renewal is seen in the life of the nation, Israel, as portrayed in the Old Testament. Most significantly, the transformation brought about by Moses can be likened to spiritual springtime. The appearance of Christ is another example of a divine springtime in the history of the world." End quote. These verses are describing the divine springtime when the true faith of God would be renewed by the appearance of the forerunner, the Elijah figure, meaning the Bab, who first proclaimed his divine station in May in 1844, and the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah, who made the great announcement of his being the Messiah of the latter days in April of 1863. The authoritative writings of the Baha'i faith address the meaning of divine springtime thus, quote, "The appearances of the manifestations of God are the divine springtime. When Christ appeared in this world, it was like the vernal bounty. The outpouring descended. The world found new life. Even the physical world partook of it. The divine perfections were upraised. Souls were trained in the school of heaven, so that all grades of human existence received life and light. Then, by degrees, these fragrances of heaven were discontinued. The season of winter came up on the world. The beauties of spring vanished. The excellencies and perfections passed away. The lights and quickening were no longer evident. The phenomenal world and its materialities conquered everything. The spiritualities of life were lost. The world of existence became life unto a lifeless body. There was no trace of the spring left. Baha'u'llah has come into this world. He has renewed that springtime. The same fragrances are wafting. The same heat of the sun is giving life. The same cloud is pouring its rain. And with our own eyes we can see that the world of existence is advancing and progressing. The human world has found a new life." End quote. This describes the spiritual effect of the appearances of the new manifestations of God on the peoples of the earth. Verse 32, quote, "As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near." End quote. Now here is an embellished verse 32 that adds some explanatory comments to clarify it. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, divine springtime is come, and you know that summer is near, meaning the establishment of God's kingdom on earth is near. If one insists on a more literal interpretation of the parable, the Bab, the forerunner, proclaimed his identity on May 23, 1844, in the springtime, the same time of year that the fig tree's twigs get tender and its leaves come out. And the new Messiah, Baha'u'lláh, also proclaimed his station as the Messiah, the returned Christ, the one who sits on the throne of the book of Revelation, the Lord of hosts of the Old Testament, in the springtime, April of 1863. A little closer look at verse 33, quote, "Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door." End quote. The reference to it means the end of the age and the beginning of a new age, and the coming of the kingdom of God on earth. That verse 33 just wraps it up, that the kingdom of God on earth is not far off, since the new Messiah has already come, since all these signs have occurred. Then there's the phrase at the end, quote, "right at the door." It, the kingdom of God on earth, is right at the door. Remember that the Bab was the herald of the Messiah, and his name means the gate or door leading to the Messiah and the kingdom of God on earth. Verses 34 and 35, quote, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." End quote. First, we'll explore the term "this generation" in verse 34 at the top. The term "this generation" has puzzled Christians and Bible prophecy buffs for centuries. Did Jesus think he would return within the next 40 years, the generally accepted span of time for a generation? His earlier comments in this chapter strongly indicated that he would not return for a long, long time. 40 years is not that long. This was confusing to the disciples of Jesus and the 50 generations or so since Jesus walked the earth. It leaves the question, what generation was or will be this generation? The year of the return of the Messiah was 1844, when the Bab made his announcement, all according to Bible prophecy mathematics, time prophecies. If you recall from earlier in this video series, in section 3 of the part 1 video of this two-part video set. Thus, this generation refers to the generation who would be alive at the time that Daniel prophesied that the Messiah would return, meaning around the year 1844. Next, we'll concentrate on verse 35, quote, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away," meaning the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. Jesus is assuring his followers, at the time he spoke those words and for many centuries since that his followers have read those words, that he really would return. He is telling them to keep the faith, to be steadfast, that what he was telling them is true. He would return. Regarding the phrase that the words of Jesus Christ would never pass away, this is very clear. but I thought it would be interesting to show what the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah, said of the words that Jesus said there. Quote, and this is from Baha'u'llah, "Whatsoever hath proceeded out of his, Christ's, blameless, his truth-speaking, trustworthy mouth can never be altered." End quote. Now to explain the last verses of Matthew chapter 24 from verse 36 through 51. Now for verse 36, quote, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." End quote. This verse 36 seems to always be mentioned by Christians when I try to tell them that the Messiah has returned. They say, "He couldn't have returned because the Bible says that we won't know the day or the hour." Well, quite often this is used as an excuse to not even investigate. Remember, Jesus said to be watchful. The thief in the night would come unannounced, and that you should watch for him. So in effect, this verse has become one of the clouds that obscures the coming of the Messiah, the clouds that were prophesied in this chapter of Matthew. And we now know the day and hour because it happened already and is in the past. The Bab proclaimed his mission and station as a manifestation of God, the forerunner to the Messiah who would appear very soon after him. Again, to reiterate, the day and the hour are now known. And this is it, May 23rd, 1844, at 2 hours after sunset. Now you know. From the writings of Baha'u'llah, quote, "The hour which we had concealed from the knowledge of the peoples of the earth and of the favored angels hath come to pass." End quote. On to verses 37 to 41, quote, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with the hand mill, one will be taken and the other left." End quote. We will start with verses 37 and 38, "As it was in the days of Noah," etc. The corresponding verses in the book of Mark, chapter 13, verses 34, 35, and 37, describe a much more direct meaning, telling all to keep watch and be ready since he could return at any time around the year 1844. Quote, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or at dawn. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch." End quote. The wording in the book of Luke, chapter 17, brings in an allusion to some good old wrath of God coming if the people do not watch and recognize and obey the new Messiah from God. Fire and sulfur, brimstone, would rain down on them and destroy them, just like the flood destroyed the peoples who ignored the warnings of Noah. The Luke verse corresponding to the Matthew 24 verses 37 through 39 starts with a reference to the days of Noah, just like Matthew. But verse 28 of Luke chapter 17 states, quote, "It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down and destroyed them all." End quote. This is backed up, by the way, in the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 21, wherein humanity is warned of the hailstorms that would bombard us if we do not obey God. Just a little FYI. Most of the warnings cross-referencing Noah are telling of people who are very busy with worldly matters such as marrying, eating and drinking, apparently everyday life and happenings. Not anything about their doing evil things necessarily, just apparently not giving much thought to the potential return of the Messiah and being prepared for his return. They would be a people who would be spiritually asleep. Verse 39, quote, "And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." End quote. What does flood mean in this context? This verse emphasizes that people would be completely unaware of his coming until the flood overtakes them. The Messiah, the return of the Christ Spirit, would come as a thief in the night. In the book of Revelation, the angel opened the seventh seal, and the hailstorms began to descend upon humanity. Both the flood and the hailstorm symbolizes the damage to the spiritual condition of humanity that results from people not recognizing and abiding by the new revelation from God brought by the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Verses 40 and 41, quote, "Two men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding with the handmill, one will be taken and the other left." End quote. What does "be taken" mean? Does it mean you will be snatched up into the sky as a part of the "meet the Lord up in the air" verse we reviewed earlier? Or does it mean that the faithful who kept watch will recognize their Lord, the new Messiah, who would be in a new physical temple, and thus they would soar into the atmosphere of his love through the teachings of Baha'u'llah? Remember our previous discussion about the real translation of the Greek word aera. Not air, but rather atmosphere. The first option, being snatched up into the sky, would certainly be supernaturally fantastic and fly in the face of all the previous methods that God has used to communicate with us, his creation. The second option is spiritual and logical. I choose the second option to explain the story of people being taken by their own choice and spiritual effort. Verses 42 through 47, quote, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions." End quote. Here's some key phrases and thoughts that are in these verses. Keep watch. That has been the message throughout chapter 24. Be alert, watch for signs, and investigate. The warning to watch for the thief. Here a direct reference to Christ returning as a thief in the night, which is directly stated in the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 15, quote, "Look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed." End quote. Of course, the book of Revelation would not be known to the writer of the book of Matthew, but the return of the Messiah as a thief was mentioned in 1 Thessalonians and in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. The faithful and wise servant from the parable of the fig tree in verses 32 to 35, most have deduced that this refers to the leaders of his religion, especially with the next phrase, the faithful servant feeding the servants in his owner's household, that the leaders of his religion, clergy and others in leadership positions, are charged to feed his flock, his other servants in the household. This food would be spiritual guidance, Failure to serve his fellow servants good fruits would, of course, mean that these leaders are misleading their flocks. But if he is faithful and is ready and has been guiding other servants properly, the returned Messiah will put such a servant in a position where he will be a recipient of the spiritual bounty of God. This is not about the gain of material wealth, but rather that of the Spirit. And the last verses of Matthew chapter 24, that's verses 48 through 51, quote, "But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time, and he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." End quote. End of chapter 24 of Matthew. Here are some of the key words and phrases for these last verses. That servant is wicked. When he thinks the master will be delayed, yet another warning to all of us to stay faithful and watch for his return. Beat his fellow servants. A warning for those who do lose faith and behave badly and contrary to the words of Jesus, leading them to take advantage of their fellow servants. The master will come on a day at an hour that is not expected. Again, the warning that he'll come when unexpected. Note that there is no mention that the year of his return would be unknown. Just the day and the hour would not be known. So we do know the year 1844, which was the year the Bab declared that he was the promised one, who was also the herald of one greater than he who would soon appear, meaning Baha'u'llah. And last there, will cut him, the servant, to pieces, assign him to a place with the hypocrites. This threat to cut to pieces the bad servant is in verse 51, the very last verse of the chapter. I kind of assume this threat should be taken symbolically, not cut off as in killed, but rather cut off from the presence of God. Seems awfully harsh wording, but God's servants are precious to him, so those who abuse them physically or spiritually will be cut off from close reunion with God. Remember the words of Psalm 37 verse 9, quote, "For evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait on the Lord, they shall inherit the earth." End quote. A couple slides follow that are quotes, messages from the Messiah of the latter days, addressed to you and to all the peoples of the world. From the pen of Baha'u'llah, quote, "Say, O followers of the Son, Jesus Christ, have ye shut out yourselves from me by reason of my name? Wherefore ponder ye not in your hearts? Day and night ye have been calling upon your Lord, the Omnipotent, but when he came from the heaven of eternity in his great glory, ye turned aside from him and remained sunk in heedlessness. Consider those who rejected the Spirit, Jesus Christ, when he came unto them with manifest dominion. How numerous the Pharisees who had secluded themselves in synagogues in his name, lamenting over their separation from him. And yet when the portals of reunion were flung open, and the divine luminary shone resplendent from the dayspring of beauty, they disbelieved in God, they exalted the mighty. They failed to attain his presence, notwithstanding that his advent had been promised them in the book of Isaiah, as well as in the books of the prophets and the messengers. No one from among them turned his face towards the dayspring of divine bounty, except such as were destitute of any power amongst men. And yet today every man endowed with power and invested with sovereignty prideth himself on his name. Moreover, call thou to mind the one who sentenced Jesus to death. He was the most learned of his age in his own country, whilst he, who was only a fisherman, believed in him. Take good heed, and be of them that observe the warning." And here is an excerpt from a tablet Baha'u'llah wrote to the kings of the earth, but it applies to all leaders of the various nations on earth. Quote, "O kings of the earth, he who is the sovereign Lord of all is come. The kingdom is God's, the omnipotent protector, the self-subsisting. Worship none but God, and with radiant hearts lift up your faces unto your Lord, the Lord of all names. This is a revelation to which whatever ye possess can never be compared, could ye but know it. We see you rejoicing in that which ye have amassed for others, and shutting out yourselves from the worlds which naught except my guarded tablet can reckon. The treasures ye have laid up have drawn you far away from your ultimate objective. This ill beseemeth you, could ye but understand it. Wash your hearts from all earthly defilements, and hasten to enter the kingdom of your Lord, the Creator of earth and heaven, who caused the world to tremble, and all its peoples to wail, except them that have renounced all things, and clung to that which the hidden tablet hath ordained." And this excerpt from his book, titled Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah. Quote, "Call out to Zion, O Carmel, and announce the joyful tidings. He that was hidden from mortal eyes is come. His all-conquering sovereignty is manifest. His all-encompassing splendor is revealed. Beware lest thou hesitate or halt. Hasten forth and circumambulate the city of God that hath descended from heaven, the celestial Kaaba." That's a metaphorical reference to the new revelation of God, "round which have circled in adoration the favored of God, the pure in heart, and the company of the most exalted angels. Oh, how I long to announce unto every spot on the surface of the earth, and to carry to each one of its cities the glad tidings of this revelation, a revelation to which the heart of Sinai hath been attracted, and in whose name the burning bush is calling, Unto God the Lord of Lords belong the kingdoms of earth and heaven. Verily, this is the day in which both land and sea rejoice at this announcement, the day for which have been laid up those things which God, through a bounty beyond the ken of mortal mind or heart, hath destined for a revelation. Ere long will God sail his ark upon thee, and will manifest the people of Baha, who have been mentioned in the Book of Names." End quote. Your course on Matthew chapter 24 is almost completed. All that remains is the exam. Your test consists of whether you choose to investigate the claims of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i faith, or not. Your test results will only be graded by yourself and God. Well, this definitely illustrates the progress we have made to this point, where we're at section 6. The next several slides give some information sources to find out more about the Baha'i faith, its history, founders, laws, etc. Included are videos, websites, and some books. I recommend that you watch this professionally produced 30-minute video on the life of Baha'u'llah and the start of the Baha'i faith as an introduction. Its title is The Prisoner of Akka. To access this video, go to YouTube and to the channel named Baha'i Vision, as you see at the bottom of the slide, and look for the video by that name, The Prisoner of Akka. You may also just be able to enter the title into the YouTube search box, The Prisoner of Akka, and then look for this exact title. A great way to get authoritative insight into the mission of the Bab and the history of the beginnings of the new faith called the Baha'i faith, this professionally produced documentary brings to life the opening drama of the continuance of the greatest story ever told. Its title is The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith. It's available for free on YouTube, and it's about 1 hour in length. The easiest way to get to it on YouTube is to, well, you get to YouTube first, youtube.com, and then you enter into the search box at the top the name of the channel, and that's at the bottom right hand corner of the slide here. That channel is The Gate Film, all one word with no spaces between. The Gate Film. Note that there are numerous versions in a variety of languages, so you want to make sure you select a version in the language of your choice. And this video about the life of Abdul-Baha, known as the center of the covenant and the exemplar in the Baha'i faith. Remember, he's the branch foretold in the Bible prophecy. Go to YouTube through youtube.com, and into the search box on that website, enter the channel name Baha'i Perspective, BAHA' Perspective, as shown in the bottom right. Then on their page, scroll down to find the video titled Exemplar. It's 55 minutes in length, but it's so well done that the time passes very quickly. Now this video is a must-watch. It's titled Christ Has Returned. It's one of my videos on my channel that you see at the bottom there, Integral Destiny 9. It explains in detail Bible time prophecies that tell when the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ, would appear, and how the Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith fulfill those time prophecies. Here are some official Baha'i websites. Top one there is www.bahai.org. That's the international official website for those seeking information about the Baha'i faith, and it has a link to the online library of sacred and authoritative texts that are available, accessible for free. Next is www.bahai.us. That's the USA official website for seekers who want information about the Baha'i community in the United States. Then we have Baha'i.org/library, and that is access, again, free to the sacred and authoritative texts and other publications by worldwide Baha'i community. Then at the bottom, the USA bookstore. That's Baha'ibookstore.com. It's the official online bookstore for the USA. You can purchase books, videos, music, and some other items through this site as well. You don't have to be a Baha'i to purchase things. The National Organization of the Baha'is of the United States has a presence on both Facebook and its own YouTube channel. Both of their pages in these websites goes by the name Baha'is of the United States. More websites. Top one, BahaiTeachings.org. This is a blog site where you can find numerous articles written about subjects touching on the Baha'i faith and the teachings. It's not an official site, but rather is produced by some individual Baha'is. There's a variety of topics in here, so if you have any specific topic, you can go on there and try to find articles to enlighten you what the view from the Baha'i faith might be. Next is the access address to the YouTube channel of the Wilmette Institute, which is an online Baha'i educational site that has webinars and actual online courses. Some are free and some at a cost, on a wide spectrum of Baha'i topics. The easiest way to get there is to go to youtube.com, then in the search box put their channel name, which is, as you see there, Wilmette Institute. We have a Baha'i World News Service which can be reached through the website you see there, https:// news.baha'i.org. And then to read some examples of some Baha'i prayers, go to www.baha'iprayers.org. If you'd like to find a book that gives a good, interesting overview of the Baha'i faith, its main figures, history, beliefs, and its followers, without being preachy or trying to convert you, this is the book for you. Its title is Baha'u'llah and the New Era by the author J.E. Esselmont. It's available through Amazon.com and probably other online book vendors too. It may even be in your local library or your local independent bookstore. Here's a list of many of my other videos, all on YouTube, mostly on prophecy fulfillment by the main 4 founding figures of the Baha'i faith. You can read the titles. There's a variety of topics. Pause the video to review them to see if any might interest you. Instructions on how to access them, all for free, on YouTube is on the next slide. Here's how to find my videos on YouTube. You have to get to YouTube first in the first method, and that is www.youtube.com. You get to the site, and in the search box on that site you enter my channel name of Integral Destiny 9. You see they're all one word, no spaces between, with the number 9 at the end. Or you can simply put the URL into the search box of your, like Google, whatever, www.youtube.com/c/ then my YouTube channel Integral Destiny 9, as you see there, and that should get you directly there, so I understand. And you'll see a list of videos, and you just have to roam around on my channel and find those videos. A really great book on the prophecies of Jesus in chapter 24 of the book of Matthew is this one by Michael Sowers, titled The Prophecies of Jesus. His scholarly, yet very easily read and understood book was a great source of information and helped enormously in my understanding of the Bible. I highly recommend it. It's available through Amazon.com. The web address is at the bottom, but there are other internet bookstores or maybe even your local bookstore. I do want to push independent bookstores for their business. Please note that this video is an amateur production by this singular person, me. It is not an official production of the Baha'i faith community. Copyright protections are claimed. Please do not make changes, additions, or deletions to this presentation. Questions? Contact me at the email address you see there, and of course, thanks for watching. Bye.